Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars.
SoundCartel.
Well, it sure was a big spender, with huge bucks in aged care, childcare, mental health and infrastructure, all with a focus on jobs and, of course, pushing this country out of COVID and into the future. But what about you and your business? From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. For a peek into the ins and outs of the 2021 federal budget, let's go straight to the experts for some answers. Professor Neville Norman of Melbourne University has seen and advised governments on more budgets than most of us have had hot dinners. Neville addresses the key economic implications, while accountants and business advisory partner Michael Jones of Mazars highlights the tax essentials. Neville starts with his overall judgment of this May 2021 federal budget. He and Michael are talking to Heather Dawson.
Amazing. 2 years ago, we would never have thought that we'd be saying what a good budget it is with $100 billion deficits in it from a government that was priding itself on turning around microscopic deficits into microscopic surpluses. But what a pleasure it is to have Michael back again, a tag team. We're going to do a bit of interaction here. And Michael, you've been a star in helping businesses through the tax and other issues, and it's a pleasure to interact with you.
Hello, Neville.
Overall economic judgment. The Treasurer says growth engine is roaring back. I agree with him, but not on all cylinders. Parts of travel and tourism, education, migration and those connected with it, and certainly international travel, are not firing. It'll take a while. And even when COVID goes and the restrictions go, there's a psychological barrier, and that lies behind all of us. On the government's own numbers, we're back to a growth track of 4 first and then about 2% a year. And that's going to be with permanently lower migration and much lower than our trading partners. A little disappointment. None of the budget numbers are COVID scenario sensitive. Forget about the budget. All of your own budgets, worked with your friendly accountants, should make explicit assumptions about COVID, the restrictions, and the psychic responses of your customers, suppliers and others, and do at least 3 of them and see what difference that makes and be prepared for all of them. So the overall economic assessment is that this is a budget that's been delivered by a government that's been prepared to sacrifice its paranoid obsession in the past, not just this government. Former Labor governments have been similar, and it's the only alternative. If we hadn't had the big spending packages, we would have been in a big hole, and this is a pretty good outcome, but not for everybody.
Would you like to comment on the interest rate scenario, Neville?
Briefly, the Reserve Bank says, almost promises, rates low until 2024. Probably right, but dangerous. If we have a COVID gone quickly scenario, they're going to need to raise interest rates, and this will be a real constraint. So don't rule it out, but for the next couple of years, low rates, they don't stimulate economic activity. But if they find that it's boom time, then to quell inflation and imports, which are already growing rapidly in this budget, there will be a need to do what they've said they won't, and that could be embarrassing.
OK, well, back to the budget and the business impacts of it. Michael, maybe turn to you first. There's not a huge amount tax-wise, is there?
No, the focus in this budget hasn't really been on tax, and certainly no interesting tax reform. Perhaps as we were talking before, Neville, I'll mention briefly, the only tax reform that you could talk about is a change that was made for small businesses, and that means someone with turnover less than $10 million, they can apply to the AAT to put a pause or modify any ATO debt recovery actions for debts that are in dispute. And that's something new and helpful to those small businesses. They may have a disputed debt with the tax office, and the tax office may consider that number they owe extremely high. Now, if that business has to go and borrow from the bank, the bank sees this disputed amount at the tax office and it's crippling for them. So it's a very good measure.
And in the old days, Michael, it used to be you'd talk to somebody in the tax office and justified or not, they'd say, look, we've got a dispute, but we won't even look at that unless you pay up front and try and get it back later. So this is a move from that, isn't it?
It is. It is an improvement. And it's interesting what you say, that even as environment, there are certainly some incentives for business to spend, and we'll go through that.
Well, one that captured me, I've been looking at intellectual property for a long time. The long-term policy is basically migration, capital expenditure, and particularly technology and creation of invention innovation. The patent system can be a barrier, and the fact that they've gone for this concessional tax rate of 17% for what they call the patent box, there will be some people, including those listening to this, for whom that's a real incentive. But I wanted to focus on the business impacts, Michael. You might quickly outline what they've done. The two most important ones, of course, being the business tax breaks with the COVID losses and the instant write-off, unlimited now. Give us the details and I'll make a comment on it.
Well, basically, it's what we have in place at the moment. It's simply been extended so that it'll finish at 30 June 2023. Now, under this measure, it allows you to write off in the same year that you purchase any eligible depreciable assets, as long as they're used and installed ready by 30 June 2023. So you've got a long horizon in order to do that. Now, of course, there's two things to comment about that. When you're bringing forward a depreciation deduction, it's just timing. The deduction you might have spread over 5 years, you now get the chance to claim it in 1 year. But that's only useful if you've got taxable income. So you do need to consider what you're doing. But it also ties in nicely with another government incentive that has been extended, and that's the temporary company loss carryback rule, which what that basically means is you might make a loss this year, including perhaps the extra depreciation that you've claimed on this instant asset write-off. Now, that loss isn't useful to you if you haven't got any profits, but the government is allowing you to carry that loss back, and it can go back to as early as the 2019 financial year and offset that loss against any taxable income in those years and get a refund of tax paid in relation to those years. So it's true, Neville, the government is still extending its incentives to business to help them spend.
I just want to come back quickly on a couple of the economic things. We've mentioned capital expenditure. The government expects a big boom out of this because in the year following the budget year, 12.5% physical increase in plant and equipment in the non-mining sector. Now, some people have said to me in a very famous Mazars business breakfast, that's a huge number, couldn't be possible. And I said, well, we've had up to 30% growth in 1 year. Now, if we had anything like that, if this was take-up for this was enormous, then you can kiss goodbye the low interest rate scenarios and even some of the other forecasts that we've got here. But I'm broadly in agreement. I've read them all, the forecasts of the government, except that COVID can go in unpredictable ways. I'm a little concerned about vaccination not working and India blowing up into a long delay in international arrivals and so on. But the other one is that it all gets over very quickly. We're not ready for the boom that will come, and I just hope the government's more ready than they were for the rest of it.
What about property out of this budget?
Well, there is a small thing there in the superannuation, in the First Home Super Saver Scheme increase. So what that is that the maximum amount of contributions that can be released from superannuation under the First Home Super Saver Scheme will be increased from 30,000 to 50,000. So that means you put particular contributions over years, and that's limited to 17,000, and then you can take it out and use it for a deposit on a home. Personally, there's a question about whether super and home use is appropriate, but that's an incentive which will give people more access to be able to spend on homes. What do you think, Neville?
It does. No hope for renters is a simple economist thing. They didn't want to do that. There's two other mini schemes there. Of course, the 2% for the single parent home buyers or single home buyers and the extension of the first home buyer scheme. The economic effects of that are to raise house prices. So help for those ones, but for everybody else, house price scenario is separate from COVID. It's roaring along. Lying behind it is low interest rates, parental help, the fact that it's a jolly good asset, and you could quibble about this, no capital gains tax on houses. You put all that together and you've got the housing boom that we've seen and will have for some time into the future. Melbourne, Sydney house prices still rising for another year, but not as much as we saw the last year. So don't hold off for the crash in housing prices. It ain't going to happen.
Yes.
Before we end, Michael, just a few adjustments to superannuation that I think you think are positive.
Yes. I'll mention briefly one other thing. It's changed the residency rule for individuals. So it's always been a matter of balancing up different factors. The proposed change is now that if you're physically present in Australia for 183 days or more in any income year, then you'll be an Australian tax resident for that. I'll leave it at that, but that's an important consequences for some people in that. For super, let me give a quick wrap. What I find interesting about the budget is it's reaching out to a class. It's made some changes, small changes, but helpful, particularly helpful for a group of people, mainly older Australians who haven't had the superannuation system for most of their working life and are really going to have less super often than other people will end up getting. And to help them catch up, there's a couple of measures which I think it's quite interesting. First, they're removing the work test for non-concessional contributions and salary sacrifice contributions. I won't go on too much, but it's a stupid test and thank goodness they get rid of it.
Hear. They
are keeping it for personal, meaning tax-deductible contributions. I don't know why the governments just can't just clean up the whole thing, but that's a discussion for another time. The other measure is that the downsizer eligibility has been lowered from age 65 to 60. Now, the downsizer is where the government gives an incentive so that if you sell your house, so you had to be 65 years or older, now it's going to be 60. You sell your house, you can contribute $300,000 into super from the proceeds of the house. It's trying to free up real estate and enable people to put something into super. Whether it'll work or not, difficult to say. It's a lot of more factors than super about selling your house, but we'll see. The one point I like to make is this $300,000 can be put into super no matter how much you have in super, even if you've got a limit, so you've reached your limit and you can't make other contributions, you can still make this downsizer contributions. That means timing's important. So maximise your other contributions, then do the downsizer contribution.
Great advice. A quick one on long-term migration. If we have the suppression of tourists and migrants for much longer, then our population growth will slow. Already, the contribution of migration to population growth is negative, more people leaving the country permanently than coming in, and we don't want that. And what it will mean is that the dependency ratio will go up. The ratio of aged welfare payments, which is a big item in the budget, relative to the taxpayers will go down for the simple reason that migrants tend to be more working and younger. And if we slow that down, as not our fault, it's COVID that's done it, that's a thing to watch out on. But there's an enormous number of opportunities out of all of this. Overall, given the circumstances of COVID, very, very high result. Excellent marks for the government, and I would say, looked at the performance of the Treasurer, particularly at the Press Club, the best Treasurer we've had since Paul Keating, and he didn't have much to beat.
That was Professor Neville Norman of Melbourne University and Michael Jones of Mazars. Business Essentials Daily is a SoundCartel podcast. Executive producer is Heather Dawson. Producers are Nick Schilberger, Chris Ashmore and myself. Technical production by Pete Letts and Belinda Trimboli. I'm Nicole Goodman. Thanks for listening. We'll bring you more B Daily next week. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.